All right, thanks for joining for this video. In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the basics of business. This lecture would be very typical of a first or second day in a beginning business course. But we're going to be laying some of the foundation for like an intro to business course. So we're going to be talking about this idea of a business and how they operate. And then we're going to get into a really important topic that really is underlying the whole concept of business, and that's the concept of a mutually beneficial exchange. So let's get into this concept of a business. So when we first talk about a business, we're really talking about any organization that sells goods and services. I should say goods or services in an attempt to earn what we call profit. Now, we're going to unpack this definition here. When we talk about business, this is really what we're referring to. This is really the core, is any organization that sells goods or services in an attempt to earn profit. So you'll notice that by definition, this encompasses a wide array of organizations, but also precludes some others. So first, let's look at kind of some of the delineating factors here. So the first thing we're going to look at is this concept of a good or a service. So in order to be a business by definition, the organization has to be able to sell something. So offer for sale a good or a service. Now, goods typically, both of these I might add, we generally refer to them as what we call products. So a good being a tangible product, something that has a form, shape, like a book, for example. A service being something that is intangible. It can't be held. It doesn't have a specific form. It's often produced and consumed at the same time. So a great example of this would be if you were to go in and you were to get a haircut. Obviously not during COVID, of course, unless you're outside. But in normal times, you go into a barbershop or you go into a salon and you pay for the service, and it's both produced and it's consumed at the same time. It can't be stored for later. So those are a few characteristics that would separate goods or services. Now, ultimately, it doesn't matter which one the business provides, only if it provides one or the other. And many times, many businesses provide something that's kind of a hybrid or combination of the two. So think about a restaurant setting, for example. A restaurant, of course, there is both a good and a service. The good being the food that you're provided and end up consuming, and then obviously the service by the waiter or waitress who takes your order and brings you your food and all those other sorts of things. So it's very rare that there's a pure good or a pure service. Oftentimes we have hybrids of the two. Now notice by definition, this actually eliminates what we would call a nonprofit from consideration as a business, because nonprofits typically don't sell goods or services. Their primary function is, of course, tackling a social issue of some kind, typically funded through donations and other sorts of funding mechanisms. And as a result, they're not selling goods and services predominantly, although that could come up. That really isn't their core function to sell a good or a service. Now, the second part of that is this idea of earning what we call profit. And this is a very important element. So these two conditions have to be met for us to have essentially what we would call a for-profit business, or just a business for short. And that's the idea of earning profit. Now, notice this says attempt. And as we know, particularly now, I'm recording this obviously during COVID, and I'm in California, which is obviously not a great place to be for COVID at the moment. Profit is obviously fleeting and can be difficult to attain. It is not a guarantee. So really, this mindset is the attempt to earn, not the guarantee of profit. So let's kind of talk about profit a little bit, because it gets used differently. So profit is really what a business earns after paying for all its expenses. So businesses have a couple of different line items, and this is going to be a very general kind of structure for profit. The first thing is a business earns revenue. Now, revenue is what a business brings in from selling things, and we'll say selling items. So if you were to think about a retailer has an e-commerce store or a brick and mortar or physical location, and there are items for sale. And when you go to a cash register and hand over your debit card or use your watch to pay, that retailer essentially earns revenue. Or when you're online and you're shopping on Amazon or another e-commerce site and you complete a transaction, of course, that represents revenue. So really the rough calculation for revenue for a business is the number of items sold multiplied by kind of the price per item. Or you can say, the average order value, or however you want to delineate it, but that's basically kind of the rough equation for it. So this is what the business brings in. Now, revenue is a really important thing because what revenue does is by a consumer being willing to pay for something that you create, the consumer is saying that the value of what I am getting, the value of what you're providing me, is actually greater than the money that I'm foregoing. And that's very important here. And by selling something, what a business essentially is kind of receiving is validation for their product concept, right? If no one's willing to pay money, then obviously that validates that there's not a need for the product. But by earning revenue, businesses essentially validate what we call product market fit. And so it's revenue is very important, not only for covering your business operations, but it also represents that there is a group of consumers that value what you do. Now, whether there's enough of them is a completely different story, but ultimately we know there's some out there, so there is a need that we are fitting. Now, it would be great if we could keep all of this revenue that we earn, but unfortunately that's not how it works. So in addition to the revenue, we now have to factor out what we call expenses. And I'm going to keep this pretty broad and kind of high level. And so I apologize if you want to go through like the specific cost of goods sold and those sorts of things. We'll get to that. But expenses very generally, very broadly, just refer to the cost of running the business. And I'm sure if you're sitting there, you can imagine what some of these costs might be. So we have payroll costs to pay for the labor and the personnel that help us to operate our business model. We pay advertising expenses. We have facility expenses, utility expenses, really all sorts of things. Taxes, interest on debt, if we have debt, insurance, all those things get factored out. Now, again, this is a very high level discussion. There's much more, and there's a certain order and priority of things that we won't get into for the purpose of this lecture, but we will in future lectures. So the difference between those two then becomes profit. That's what the business earns after covering all of their expenses. Now, profit is important for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that the business needs profit to be able to reinvest back into the business and actually earn more revenue and then earn more profit. So if profit isn't there, the business does not have the funds necessary to make investments, whether that's purchasing additional equipment, purchasing more inventory, paying down debt, investing in pursuing new marketing channels. So profit is really, really important. Profit doesn't necessarily, mean that the business is not necessarily only adding value, right? Revenue is all about value creation, but profit represents it's able to do that, but it's also able to operate its business the way that it should. Its business model is working. And if profit isn't there, it usually is an indication that there's something fundamentally wrong with the business model. Something is not working, whether the business has its payroll costs are out of whack, or it's not managing its inventory very well. Something in the model is not functioning. So that's the first thing, right? Your profitability is important for reinvesting and growing your business over time. The second thing that profit is important for is, for many business owners, profit represents earnings. And if the business is profitable, then the owners can potentially draw on that profit and pay themselves for the hard work of starting and growing the business. So those are some reasons that profit is very important. Again, not a guarantee, but this is really the attractiveness that many feel in launching their own business, because there's this idea of profit, and if I do this well, then it can be financially rewarding for me, and I'm providing something that provides value to a group of people if I can do it right, which is great. Now, underpinning this entire kind of concept, if you will, is this idea of a mutually beneficial exchange. And I'm going to keep this discussion fairly brief. But the mutually beneficial exchange concept is really it really supports this idea of free markets. And that's really, businesses thrive in free markets where they have the ability to decide what they're going to create and then offer that to someone else. And then consumers can decide if they're willing to part with their hard-earned money for whatever it is that is created. So under a mutually beneficial exchange, you have the two parties, right? You've got the buyer, who in this case may be you, and the seller, and they agree to a transaction, right? So the buyer agrees to send over, pay money that they've earned, and the seller agrees to provide some type of product. And both parties are happy. Both parties have the willingness to decide if they want to engage in the transaction. That's kind of a key characteristic there. Obviously, no one's being forced to engage in a transaction here. And so this is really the concept that underpins this whole idea of free markets, is buyers and sellers being able to engage in transactions on their own without any kind of being forced to do so. Now, this is important here because if you go back to how a business earns a profit, if a business is only going to earn profit if it's able to manage its expenses correctly and obviously earn revenue over here, and if the only way that it's going to earn revenue is by selling goods and services, and the only person who's going to provide that revenue for the goods and services is the buyer over here, then it's really important that the seller, in this case the business, provides goods or services that are really appealing to the buyer. And that's where you get into designing products that solve problems. That's where you get into kind of the marketing and the positioning element of it. The only way that businesses earn revenue is really by being very in tune with what their consumers want and building or creating something that's going to solve a fundamental problem for them. When you look at businesses that aren't successful, could be a variety of reasons, but ones that really don't get off the ground, it's generally because they just simply don't solve a problem. Nobody really cares at the end of the day. And we as consumers get to choose where we put our hard-earned money. And that generally is something that solves a problem for us. Now, that could be something super minor. It could be something really significant. But when we look at the whole idea of businesses operating, and again, this is all really, really simple on paper. Just produce something that people want. It's super simple, right? I'm being facetious, of course. But if we really want to operate a business, and if businesses want to be successful, then we have to look at the buyer and then really discover what it is that we're going to create to solve a problem. And through that process, we'll have the ability to earn revenue, which will in turn help cover expenses. And if we can do so efficiently, we'll hopefully end up in having some level of profitability. Obviously, much more difficult when it comes to the practice of it, but that should give you at least a little bit of a high-level overview of kind of really what the goal is for the business and what are some of the things that need to come into play for that to become a reality.